you're the fee simple property owner, you're asking for the money. Are there any other interest holders in the property that might have a claim on that money? And the most common one is a mortgage situation. And the basic legal standard, I don't have a slide on it, but the basic legal standard there is that if the mortgagee's interest is impaired, they have a right to some of the proceeds to protect their interest in the property. So fair market value is really the way that we talk about how do you figure out what compensation and damages should be. The legal standard on that is that it's the amount of money that a reasonable seller would accept when they're not under any compulsion to sell, and that a reasonable buyer would pay when it's not under any compulsion to buy, with both of those participants in the transaction being fully educated and prudent with respect to what's going on with the property. So in this area, you as the practitioner, you work a lot with experts, mostly appraisers, but also traffic engineers and land planners, a variety of other disciplines as well. But real estate appraisers is definitely by and large the norm. You have to have one in every case. In every case, the condemning authority has to base their offer, their good faith offer, on an appraisal. So you're dealing with appraisal issues. There's just no way around it in this area. And there are three basic recognized approaches to value in the eminent domain area. The first is the sales comparison approach. Anybody that's ever bought a house is familiar with this approach. This is where the appraiser goes out into the market, looks at recent sales of comparable property, and once it finds some, or once he or she finds some, makes any adjustments that they consider necessary to make the comparable or the comp even more similar to the subject property that they're valuing. This is by far the most common approach in eminent domain, as in other contexts. But it's not the only approach. The income capitalization approach is probably, in my experience at least, the second most popular. And this has to do with income producing properties, hotels, gas stations, things along those lines, apartment buildings, where the property itself, by virtue of its location and specific attributes, generates income for the property owner. And the way that the appraiser looks at it is they want to reduce the value of that income stream to present day value using what they call a cap rate, capitalization rate. And based on that calculation, they can figure out a value of the real estate itself. And this is an interesting sort of little area, because the general rule is that you're not allowed to use or not allowed to recover lost profits in an eminent domain case if you're a property owner. And the income capitalization approach is sort of a way to get that income or that profit sort of information into the mix as a way to increase your damages or your compensation as a property owner. But the key there is that the income has to be based on the attributes of the property itself, and not based on the business skill or acumen of the operator of that business. And then the third approach is the cost approach. This is usually used with brand new buildings where you don't have an existing income stream to look at, or it's a unique kind of building where you don't have comparable sales to look at. And the philosophy there is, what would it cost for the property owner to recreate this property with its use? So you might hear the term highest and best use when you're dealing with eminent domain. What it means is that property is valued for eminent domain purposes based on what we call its highest and best use, not necessarily its current use. So for example, if you owned a house on Madison Avenue in New York, that's not really the property's highest and best use because it could be a skyscraper. The standard for what is the highest and best use is what's legally allowable, physically possible, financially feasible, and maximally productive. So if it checks all those boxes, that's the use that the appraiser is going to look at and value the property based on. And here's just a case from the Ohio Supreme Court, Sowers versus Schaefer, in which that standard is enunciated. Here's just a citation to the Ohio jury instruction that deals with this issue, which talks about existing uses and then also potential uses and possible zoning changes. And this is interesting when you're talking about these highest and best uses. If it's not the current use, you're dealing in hypotheticals. So what the law says is you can consider a potential use, but it has to be one that's legally permissible within the reasonably foreseeable future and not dependent on contingencies. And that can be the subject of a motion in limine gun battle when you get into an eminent domain case as to whether there are contingencies that have to be satisfied for a particular potential use that a property owner is advocating. And then zoning, it does come into this picture a little bit. Basically, you're supposed to value the property based on the existing zoning, unless a prudent buyer would be presently willing to pay more for the property based on the possibility of a zoning change, even though it hasn't happened yet. They're willing to pay more now. And on the issue of, well, how likely is likely, you're not allowed as a property owner to put on expert evidence as to the likelihood of a zoning change. What you can have an expert testify to is, all the facts that would go into a zoning change decision by a political subdivision. But that last step, an opinion as to the ultimate likelihood that the change is going to occur, is not permissible. So you're supposed to value it based on its highest and best use, the property being taken. But when are you supposed to value it? Well, we have an answer for that too, and that's called the date of take. And in Ohio, the date of take is typically one of two dates, and that's either the first day of trial of the eminent domain case, or the earlier date that physical possession is actually taken in the case of a quick take situation. What that means is the appraiser, when they're doing these appraisals, they do essentially two appraisals. So they do one that is the before appraisal, one immediately before the taking, before the date of take. And then they do another one, which is after the take, after the date of take. And then this is oversimplifying, but basically the difference between the two is what you're entitled to as a property owner. There's an exception when you have large scale, when you have a blight situation. You see these probably in major metropolitan areas. Cleveland comes to mind, where the city would say, we have a real problem with blight in particular areas of the city. We're going to exercise eminent domain to take those. That's a basis for a taking. And then on the date of take, what you have is an adjustment. In addition to the blight that they're trying to take care of, you have what's called a condemnation blight. So the city's going in and taking out properties 1, 2 at a time, and it's driving down the value of adjacent properties in the neighborhood that are also ultimately slated for demolition and going to be taken. If you have a situation like that where the property value is decreased as a result of other takings in connection with the same project, well, then the courts are going to say, well, let's look back to the start of the project, not to the first day of trial in this case, because that would be inequitable to the property owner.